A man walked out of prison with nothing but a folded release paper and 5 years of silence behind him. And by nightfall, he would pull a drowning child out of a frozen river without knowing her mother held the one signature that could either save him or bury him for good. What happened between that riverbank and the courtroom that followed would turn a convicted criminal into the only man a millionaire lawyer could trust, and neither of them saw it coming until it was already too late to walk away. Before we get into it, if stories like this one keep you company on a quiet evening, take a second to hit subscribe and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. I'm the voice behind Winter Veil, and I'll be here with you until the very last word. So stay close, because this one earns its ending. There is something about the first snow of the season that always catches me off guard. The way it falls so quietly and covers over everything without asking permission, the ugly and the beautiful alike. I think that's why I keep coming back to stories set in winter, because snow doesn't care what you've done or who you used to be. It just settles over you and gives you a clean surface to start again. Nolan Cross needed exactly that kind of mercy, and I hope his story reminds you that even the coldest season eventually turns. Nolan Cross stepped through the gates of the Colorado State Penitentiary on a Tuesday morning in December, and the first thing he noticed was that the sky did not look the way he remembered it. 5 years changes a man's sense of color, of sound, of the ordinary weight of walking without someone watching his every step. He was 34 years old, and he had entered prison as a rising portfolio manager at Holloway Grant Capital, a firm he had helped build from a two-person office into a name printed on the side of a downtown Denver tower. He left it a convicted felon, stripped of the only identity he had ever been proud of, carrying an accusation of embezzling nearly $4 million from client accounts he had never touched. No one from the firm had come to see him during his sentence. No family waited at the gate either, and Nolan told himself he had expected exactly that, though the empty parking lot still hollowed something out of his chest when he saw it. Prison had not been gentle to a man who used to spend his days in a glass office overlooking the Rockies. The other men inside had their own theories about where $4 million disappears to, and more than one of them had tried, over the years, to convince Nolan to remember a number he simply didn't have. He had learned to keep his head down, to make himself small and unremarkable, to survive one gray winter after another behind walls that never once let real snow fall on him, only the memory of it through a narrow window. He had one number memorized, an old friend named Derek Wexler who used to tend bar with him back when they were both broke 20-somethings dreaming about better lives, splitting rent on a cramped apartment and arguing over whose turn it was to shovel snow off the front steps every winter. Nolan found a payphone 2 blocks from the prison, fed it coins from the small manila envelope the state had returned to him, and dialed the number with cold fingers. Derek's voice picked up on the fourth ring, startled at first, then warm in a way that made Nolan's throat tighten. "Nolan, is that really you?" Derek said, and something in Nolan finally allowed itself to believe that maybe he wasn't as alone as he'd feared. Derek told him to come by the bar he now co-owned on the east side of town, said there was a couch with Nolan's name on it for as long as he needed, no questions asked. Nolan thanked him quietly and hung up before his voice could crack, then started walking, because a bus ticket wasn't in his budget and his feet still remembered how to carry him through a Denver winter. Snow had started falling somewhere along the way, fine and unhurried, dusting the shoulders of his secondhand coat, and for the first time in years nobody was telling him where he was allowed to stand. The city looked different through free eyes, quieter than he remembered. The streets softened under a thin layer of white that made even the ugliest corners look forgiven. Nolan passed shop windows already strung with holiday lights, families bundled in scarves hurrying past him without a second glance, and he found a strange comfort in being invisible again after 5 years of being watched every hour of every day. He thought, walking through that hush of falling snow, that maybe this was the only kind of welcome home a man like him was going to get, and decided it would have to be enough. His route took him along Silver Creek, a slow, half-frozen tributary that cut behind a row of lakeside cabins usually rented out for weekend getaways. The current underneath the ice looked black and restless, and Nolan slowed his pace without meaning to, the way anyone does near moving water in winter. Past the first few cabins, warm lights spilled from windows, and the sound of a family laughing over a late breakfast drifted out into the cold, A normal little life playing out behind glass. The kind of life Nolan used to imagine having with his ex-wife before everything came apart. He kept walking, boots crunching over frost-hardened gravel, when the sound changed. Children's laughter, high and unguarded, rising from somewhere closer to the water than it should have been. Nolan's shoulders tensed before his mind caught up to why, some old instinct firing faster than thought, and he picked up his pace toward the sound instead of away from it, the way a man does when part of him already knows what he's about to find. Two kids darted out from behind one of the cabins, a girl who couldn't have been older than 7 and a smaller boy trailing behind her, both of them chasing something invisible and delighted, neither one looking at the ice beneath their sneakers. "Hey, stay back from the water," Nolan called out, but the wind and their own laughter swallowed his voice whole. He broke into a run, gravel giving way to frozen mud, watching in growing horror as the girl's foot slid on a patch of black ice at the very lip of the bank. She went down hard, and the current took her before she even had time to scream, dragging her small body under a shelf of half-formed ice near the bend of the creek. Nolan didn't think. He simply moved, grabbing a low, snow-heavy branch to anchor himself against the pull of the water as he waded in up to his chest, the cold hitting him like a wall of nails. His hand closed around the girl's jacket a second before the current could carry her past his reach, and he hauled her against him with everything he had left, fighting the water step by frozen step back toward the bank. He got her onto solid ground, gasping, and only then realized the boy was nowhere in sight. Panic rose in him fast and ugly, and he shouted for help until his throat burned, scanning the tree line, the frozen bank, the empty stretch of snow where a 5-year-old boy should have been standing. The girl in his arms was shaking so hard her teeth clattered, her lips already tinged faintly blue, and Nolan knew he had seconds, not minutes, to get her somewhere warm before he could go back for her brother. He carried her toward the nearest cabin, kicking the door because his hands were too numb to manage the handle, and 2 women rushed out at the sound, their faces already twisted with the particular fear only a parent understands. "She fell in the creek," Nolan said, breath tearing out of him in ragged clouds. "I got her out, but I can't find the boy." One of the women snatched the girl from his arms with a sob that came from somewhere far too deep for a simple accident, screaming a name into the wind. "Milo. Where's Milo?" That sob belonged to Sylvia, Meredith's younger sister, who had brought the kids to the cabin that week to give herself somewhere quiet to fall apart after finalizing her own divorce, and the terror on her face carried the weight of a woman who had already lost more than she could afford to lose that year. Nolan turned and ran back along the bank, shouting the boy's name until his voice gave out, and it was another agonizing 2 minutes before a small, snow-covered shape stumbled out from behind a stand of frozen pines, crying but whole, having simply run the wrong direction in his panic. Nolan scooped him up and carried him back at a dead sprint, and when the woman saw her son alive in Nolan's arms, she nearly collapsed with the relief of it, clutching both her children so tightly it looked like she meant never to let go again. It took a long moment for anyone to speak sense. The woman who had been holding the girl finally looked up at Nolan properly, taking in his soaked clothes, his blue-tinged lips, the exhaustion written across every line of his face. "I'm Meredith Sharp," she said. "This is my sister Sylvia, and that little girl is my daughter Ruby. The boy is my son Milo. I don't know how they got that door open, but if it weren't for you." Her voice broke there, and she didn't finish the sentence, because some sentences don't need finishing. Nolan told her his name was Nolan, nothing more, and waved off her gratitude the way a man does when he doesn't believe he deserves it yet. What he didn't know yet was that Meredith Sharp was one of the most sought-after corporate attorneys in Denver, a senior partner whose case fees alone had made her a millionaire well before she turned 40, and whose name carried more weight in certain rooms than his own once had. Sylvia disappeared and came back with dry clothes, a faded gray hoodie and a pair of sweatpants that didn't quite fit, and ushered Nolan toward a small bathroom to change while Meredith wrapped both children in blankets by the fireplace. When Nolan came back out, Meredith pressed a mug of coffee into his shaking hands and sat across from him, studying his face with the sharp, careful attention of someone whose whole career depended on reading people correctly. "This cabin isn't close to anything," she said gently. "Where were you walking from out here in this weather?" Nolan hesitated, the old shame rising in his throat before he could stop it. and finally said only that he'd just gotten out of somewhere he didn't want to talk about, and that he needed to get moving before dark. Meredith didn't push, though something in her eyes told him she'd already guessed more than she was saying, and she let him leave with nothing but a quiet thank you and an unspoken promise in the way she watched him walk away. Nolan reached Derek's bar an hour later, cold to the bone and hollowed out from more than just the river. Derek pulled him into a hug the second he saw him, ordered food before Nolan even sat down, and told him there was a bed waiting upstairs in the small apartment above the bar. "Man, I'm so sorry for everything you went through," Derek said, and Nolan let himself believe, just for a moment, that some things in his life hadn't changed after all. The food arrived, and Nolan ate like a man who hadn't tasted a real meal in years, until the television mounted above the bar caught his attention. A news anchor's voice rang out clearly over the clatter of glasses. Convicted financial fraud Nolan Cross was released from prison today after serving a 5-year sentence. Cross has never admitted guilt, and several former clients of Holloway Grant Capital say they still haven't recovered the money lost in the scheme. Nolan's whole body went rigid, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, the old helpless fury rising in his chest all over again. "I didn't do it," he muttered under his breath. "I never did it." Derek slid a beer toward him without a word, and Nolan drank half of it in one long pull, letting the cold burn ease something in his chest that words never could. He was exhausted in a way that went past the body, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes, and when Derek finally showed him upstairs, Nolan collapsed onto the bed without even pulling off his shoes, asleep before he had time to think about tomorrow. He woke to unfamiliar silence, blinking at an unfamiliar ceiling, and it took him a full minute to remember he was finally, technically, a free man. He got up and started down the narrow staircase toward the bar, following the smell of coffee, when Derek's voice stopped him cold from a back room. "He's here." "Yeah," Derek was saying, his tone low and careful in a way it hadn't been the night before. "I just need him to trust me a little longer, then he'll tell me where it is." Nolan froze on the stairs, his heart slamming against his ribs. "Of course he's lying," Derek continued, sounding almost irritated. "I think he's playing it humble so nobody looks twice at him. But the second I find out where that money's hidden, I'll call you. We'll handle Cross." Nolan stood there in the stairwell feeling something inside him break quietly apart. The last person he'd trusted revealed as just another liar circling him for money that didn't even exist. He forced his face into something neutral by the time he reached the bottom step, and Derek greeted him with the same easy warmth as always, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just been caught plotting against the one friend he had left. Nolan told him he needed to head out, find work, get his feet under him, and Derek, playing the part of the generous friend to the end, pulled a $100 bill from his pocket and pressed it into Nolan's hand like it was some grand act of charity. Nolan took the money and walked out into the cold, understanding now with total clarity that he had absolutely nowhere safe left standing. His old phone, dead for 5 years, had come back to life on Derek's charger overnight, and as Nolan walked, he noticed a missed call from an unknown Denver number. Some instinct told him to call it back, and a woman's voice answered on the second ring. "This is Meredith Sharp," she said, and Nolan nearly stopped walking in the middle of the sidewalk, stunned that she had somehow tracked down his number at all. "I saw your face on the news this morning," Meredith continued evenly, "and I want to talk. Will you meet me somewhere?" She named a quiet coffee shop downtown, and Nolan pulled his hood up against the cold and the stares of anyone who might recognize him from the broadcast, walking there with his head down and his pulse uneven. Meredith was already seated in the far corner when he arrived, dressed sharply despite the early hour, and she rose slightly to shake his hand as if he were any other client. "Thank you for coming," she said, and Nolan asked, warily, why she had wanted to see him at all. "I don't think you did what they said you did," Meredith told him, her eyes steady on his face. "And if you tell me the whole truth, I think I can help you." Nolan almost laughed, a short, bitter sound with no humor in it. "I've told the truth to everyone since the day they arrested me," he said, and it never mattered once. Meredith didn't flinch. "You're not actually free yet," she said quietly. "Everyone in this city knows your face now. No one will hire you. And there are people out there who blame you for money that never even landed in your pocket. So how exactly do you plan on surviving that? I'm a corporate attorney. I've represented people far more powerful than you. And if I say I can help, I can. Why would you want to? Nolan asked, and something in Meredith's expression softened just slightly. Because you pulled my daughter out of a river without stopping to think about the cost to yourself, she said. I saw exactly what kind of man does that, and it isn't the kind of man who steals from strangers. So I'm asking you one more time, will you let me help you or not? Nolan sat with the weight of that offer for a long moment, feeling the last of his pride give way to plain necessity, and finally said, quietly, yes, I'll tell you everything. Meredith brought him to a private apartment she kept for sensitive clients, high above the city with a view that made Nolan feel briefly, dizzyingly, like his old life before prison. Only my staff and I know about this place. You'll be safe here, she told him, closing the door behind them. Nolan stood at the window for a long moment looking out over the snow-dusted skyline. The same city that had branded him a thief now spread out beneath him in the dark, indifferent and enormous, and, for the first time in years, not actively trying to hurt him. Nolan took a breath and, for the first time in 5 years, told the entire story from the beginning. The falsified documents he'd never signed, the accounts he'd never touched, the missing $4 million that had somehow all pointed straight back at him. Meredith listened without interrupting, taking careful notes, her expression unreadable until he finished. We start with the senior executives who were at Holloway Grant when this happened, she said finally, and Nolan asked what good that would do after 5 years. To make them uncomfortable, Meredith answered, until someone finally tells the truth. She asked him to stay at the apartment while she worked, just until they knew it was safe, and Nolan, for lack of any better option in the entire world, agreed. One evening Meredith brought the children along because Sylvia had a late shift, and Ruby, still a little shy around the man who had pulled her from the river, spent an hour at the kitchen table drawing him a picture of a snowman with a bright red scarf. She's calling it the man who found me in the snow, Meredith said quietly, watching Nolan study the crayon drawing like it was worth more than anything he'd ever owned on paper before his conviction. Nolan folded it carefully and kept it in his jacket pocket for the rest of the investigation, a small, stubborn reminder of exactly what he still had left to fight for. Weeks passed in that careful, guarded routine, Meredith arriving most evenings with new documents and new theories, Nolan slowly learning to trust the quiet rhythm of being believed. One evening, she arrived with her expression sharper than usual, papers fanned across the table between them. If I didn't already believe you, I'd almost think you were guilty, she said. This was built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, but we're getting closer. Nolan asked whether anything like this had ever happened before, and Meredith went very still, her eyes suddenly wide with recognition. Griffin Talbot, she said slowly, the firm's chief investment officer during your trial. He left Holloway Grant less than a year after your conviction to start his own hedge fund, and it just got a massive infusion of capital right around the time your case was wrapping up. Nolan felt something cold settle low in his stomach, a name he remembered vaguely from board meetings, a man who had always seemed just a little too comfortable while Nolan's world was collapsing around him. Meredith brought in a forensic accountant named Priya Nair, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had helped her untangle corporate fraud cases before, and the three of them spent a long evening hunched over spreadsheets spread across the apartment table. This transfer pattern doesn't match a junior analyst at all, Priya said, tapping a column of numbers with her pen. Whoever moved this money understood exactly how to make it look like your login without ever touching the actual approval chain. That takes someone with real authority. Nolan asked what that meant in plain terms, and Priya looked up at him steadily. It means someone above you did this and let you take the fall for it, she said. We just need to find whose fingerprints are actually on the keyboard. Over the following weeks, with help from Priya and a cybersecurity contact Meredith trusted, they traced a pattern of shell transfers that led directly back to accounts Griffin Talbot controlled personally. The same falsified signatures that had convicted Nolan matching a digital fingerprint Talbot had never bothered to fully erase. It became clear that Talbot had engineered the entire scheme years earlier, quietly moving client funds through Nolan's login credentials while building his own fund on the side, then walking away clean the moment investigators started asking questions, leaving Nolan to take the fall entirely alone. Meredith filed for an emergency hearing the moment the evidence was solid enough to present, and for a short, fragile stretch of days it looked like the nightmare might simply be over. The story broke publicly before the hearing even happened, journalists circling both Talbot and Nolan, and for one bright afternoon Meredith allowed herself to believe the worst of it was behind them. Then Griffin Talbot's lawyers filed a countersuit against Nolan for defamation, and worse, against Meredith's firm for what they called reckless and unethical conduct in leaking privileged case material to the press before trial. The senior partners at Meredith's firm called her into an emergency meeting the next morning, faces grim around the long conference table. "This isn't just risky," one partner said coldly. "You've turned this firm into the story instead of the client, and Talbot's people are threatening to pull every account connected to us if this isn't dropped immediately." Meredith stood her ground, arguing that the evidence was airtight and the delay would only give Talbot more time to bury it deeper. "You represented that man for weeks without disclosing a personal connection," another partner said, sliding a printed page across the table, a photograph of Meredith and Nolan leaving a restaurant together. "Explain this to me like I'm one of your clients trying to decide whether I trust this firm." Meredith kept her voice level even as her pulse climbed. "That's a colleague thanking me for representing him honestly," she said. "Nothing about our conduct changes the fact that the evidence against Talbot is real and it is airtight. And if this firm drops it now out of fear, that's a decision this firm will have to live with, not me." The partner who had spoken first shook his head slowly. "The vote's already been discussed upstairs," he said, not unkindly, but firmly, "and it didn't go your way." The vote against her continuing the case came back 3-1, and she walked out of that meeting with her career hanging by exactly one very thin thread. That same evening, Nolan received a visit at the apartment from two men he didn't recognize, sent, they claimed, only to talk. "Mr. Cross, we're just here on behalf of a concerned party," the taller one said, setting an envelope on the table thick with cash. "A quiet, comfortable life somewhere far from Denver could be arranged very easily if you simply stopped cooperating with Miss Sharp's investigation." The second man added, almost gently, that people who kept digging into things like this sometimes found their lives got complicated in ways money couldn't always fix afterward. Nolan looked at the money for a long moment, thought of every day he had spent in a cell for a crime he never committed, and finally looked up at both of them with a calm that surprised even himself. "I spent 5 winters in a cell for $4 million I never touched," he said quietly. "You really think an envelope is going to scare me now?" He slid the envelope back across the table without another word, and the two men exchanged a glance before letting themselves out, which was answer enough for all three of them. When Meredith arrived that night, exhausted and shaken from her own meeting, Nolan told her about the visit, watching her face go pale with fury and fear in equal measure. "They're trying to isolate both of us at once," she said. "They cut off my firm's support, and they're trying to buy your silence, which means we're closer to the truth than either of us realized." Nolan asked her plainly whether she still intended to fight this without her firm behind her, and Meredith, without hesitation, said that she did, that she had never once let anyone's threats decide what she believed was right. "There's a condition, though," Nolan said quietly. "If we win this, I don't want to just disappear back into whatever life is left for me. I want the people who let this happen to actually answer for it in public, not in some sealed settlement." Meredith studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes, then said softly that was exactly the kind of answer she'd been hoping to hear. In that quiet apartment above the frozen city, something settled between them that was no longer only about the case. The second setback came 3 days later, sharper and colder than either of them expected. Griffin Talbot, cornered by the mounting evidence, went to the press himself first, sitting across from a local news anchor with practiced sincerity. "I've known Nolan Cross a long time," he said, his voice steady and convincingly wounded, "and it's heartbreaking to watch a talented attorney risk her own reputation defending a man she's clearly grown personally attached to. I only hope the facts speak for themselves eventually." He released photographs of Meredith and Nolan leaving the same building late one night, time-stamped and carefully cropped to suggest exactly the story he wanted told. The story exploded across every local outlet by morning, painting Meredith as a reckless attorney compromised by a personal relationship with her own client, and painting Nolan, once again, as a manipulator who knew exactly how to work a wealthy woman's sympathy. Meredith's firm suspended her pending review that same afternoon, and for the first time since Nolan had met her, He saw her composure crack completely, sitting at her kitchen table with her head in her hands while Ruby and Milo slept upstairs, unaware their mother's entire career might be ending because of a stranger she'd pulled out of a frozen creek. Nolan sat across from her, guilt closing around his throat like a fist, and told her that maybe the kindest thing he could do now was walk away and let her rebuild what he'd cost her. Meredith looked up at him sharply, her eyes wet but furious. "Don't you dare," she said. "Don't you dare decide for me what I'm allowed to risk. I chose this the moment I believed you, and I still believe you. So if you walk away now, it isn't for my sake. It's because you're scared, and Nolan, I don't think you're actually a man who runs." The room went quiet except for the soft tick of snow against the window, and Nolan realized, with a strange, aching clarity, that he wasn't scared of losing the case at all anymore. He was scared of losing her. He didn't say it yet. Instead, he asked her, quietly, what she needed from him to finish this the right way, publicly, completely, with nothing left hidden for anyone to twist later. Meredith wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and told him that there was one more piece of proof they hadn't used, an encrypted backup drive from the original IT audit that Talbot's people had assumed was destroyed years ago, still sitting untouched in a court evidence locker under an old case number nobody had thought to check. Getting a judge to authorize retrieving it took 2 more tense days. Days spent avoiding reporters camped outside Meredith's building. Days spent with Sylvia quietly caring for Ruby and Milo so Meredith could work without her children seeing the chaos splashed across every screen in the house. When the drive was finally recovered and decrypted, it contained internal messages between Talbot and a mid-level compliance officer discussing, in exact and damning detail, how to route the falsified signatures through Nolan's old login before his access was ever revoked. The emergency hearing that followed was unlike anything Denver's financial world had seen in years, packed with reporters, former clients, and the same senior partners who had suspended Meredith just days earlier, now watching in silence as she laid the entire scheme out point by point. "Your Honor," Meredith said, holding up the printed messages for the court to see, "these are Mr. Talbot's own words, discussing exactly how to route falsified signatures through my client's login before his access was revoked. This isn't circumstantial. This is a confession he didn't know anyone would ever read." Griffin Talbot's attorney rose to object, insisting the messages had been obtained through an improper evidence request, but the judge overruled him after a brief, tense exchange and asked that the full exhibit be entered into the record. Talbot himself sat rigid at the defense table, his composure finally cracking as reporters in the gallery began typing furiously into their phones, and Nolan, watching from beside Meredith, felt something in his chest unclench for the first time in 5 years. Mr. Talbot's own attorney visibly paled as the messages were read aloud in open court, and by the time the judge called a recess, it was clear to everyone in that room exactly whose name would finally be cleared and whose would take its place. Nolan was formally exonerated 11 days later, every charge vacated, his record wiped clean by a court order that made front-page news across 3 states. Griffin Talbot was arrested that same afternoon on federal wire fraud charges, though Meredith's firm, still stinging from the public spectacle, stopped short of fully reversing her suspension right away. Nolan stood on the courthouse steps afterward in the falling snow, 5 years of stolen time finally, officially, behind him, and felt strangely unmoored by how quiet the moment turned out to be. His father was waiting at the bottom of the steps, something Nolan hadn't expected at all. Roland Cross stood stiffly in his old wool coat, a former Army officer who had never once visited his son in prison, believing guilt was simply guilt regardless of evidence. "Nolan," his father said, his voice flat but not unkind, and Nolan felt 5 years of silence rise up in his chest all at once. "You didn't come once," he said quietly, "not a single time in 5 years." His father's eyes filled, briefly, with something that looked almost like shame, though he didn't try to explain it away. Nolan's ex-wife Kayla stood a few steps further back, the woman who had signed the divorce papers before his trial even finished, and when their eyes met there was nothing left there at all, just the flat distance of a bridge that had burned itself out long ago. Meredith stepped up beside him then, quiet and steady, and Nolan told her simply that his father hadn't believed him and his wife had left before the verdict even came in. "I'm sorry for all of it," Meredith said softly, and Nolan realized, standing there in the snow, that her sympathy meant more to him than either of those absent people ever had. In the weeks that followed, Nolan started rebuilding slowly, taking a position analyzing fraud cases for a nonprofit that helped wrongfully convicted people navigate exactly the kind of nightmare he'd just survived. His first week on the job, he sat across from a 19-year-old kid who reminded him painfully of himself 5 years earlier. And for the first time, his years inside felt less like a wound and more like something he could actually use for someone else's good. Roland showed up at Nolan's new apartment more than once, awkward and unpracticed at apologies, bringing coffee he didn't ask permission to bring, trying in small, clumsy ways to close a distance he'd spent years widening. "I should have come," his father admitted one evening, staring hard at his own hands instead of his son's face. "A soldier's whole life is built on trusting the chain of command, and I let that get in the way of trusting my own blood. That's on me, not you." One quiet evening not long after, Nolan looked at his father across the kitchen table and said simply, "I forgive you," and watched the older man's shoulders drop with a relief that looked almost like grief finally allowed to leave his body. Meredith and Nolan kept finding reasons to see each other long after the case had technically closed, Ruby and Milo asking about him by name whenever their mother mentioned meeting a friend for coffee. "You've reorganized your entire calendar around a man you keep calling Gratitude," Sylvia said one evening, watching her sister check her phone for the third time in 10 minutes. "At some point, Gratitude gets a different name." Mayor Meredith rolled her eyes and insisted it was simply appreciation between two people who'd survived something difficult together, though her sister only laughed harder at that, clearly not buying a single word of it. Nolan hesitated too, for longer than either of them probably needed him to, uncertain whether a man freshly rebuilding his entire life had any right to ask a woman like Meredith for more than friendship. He kept the crayon drawing Ruby had made him folded in his wallet through all of it, a small stubborn piece of proof that somewhere in this city, at least one family had never once doubted him. It was Ruby, in the end, who forced the question into the open, tugging on Nolan's sleeve one snowy afternoon in the park while Milo built a lopsided snowman a few feet away, and asking bluntly why he didn't just kiss her mom already since it was obvious he wanted to. Meredith went scarlet, telling her daughter that grown-up things were more complicated than that. But Ruby crossed her arms with the total confidence only a 7-year-old can manage and insisted it really wasn't complicated at all. Nolan laughed for what felt like the first genuine time in years, and in the quiet after the laughter faded, he finally admitted, plainly, that he had been afraid of wanting something good again after so long without it, afraid that reaching for happiness too soon might somehow prove Talbot and every doubter right about him. Meredith stepped closer, her breath fogging faintly in the cold air, and told him she understood that fear better than he knew, and that she wasn't interested in waiting around any longer for him to stop being afraid of it. Snow was falling lightly over the park as Nolan finally closed the distance between them, and whatever hesitation had lived in both of them for weeks simply dissolved into something quieter and far more certain. Ruby cheered loudly enough that a passing jogger actually turned to look, and Milo demanded to know if this meant Nolan would be at the house for pancakes every Sunday now, which, as it turned out, it did. Griffin Talbot's trial concluded that spring with a lengthy federal sentence, closing the final chapter of the story that had once nearly destroyed both Nolan's life and Meredith's career and Meredith's firm. No longer able to pretend she had been wrong about any of it, quietly reinstated her with a partnership title attached. An apology dressed up as a promotion that she accepted without ever once mentioning the 3-1 vote against her. Nolan eventually moved into a small house not far from Meredith's, close enough that Ruby and Milo could walk over after school with their boots still crusted from the walk, and Roland started showing up on Sundays too, awkward at first, then a little less so. With every plate of pancakes, he helped Milo stack too high. On the first real snowfall of the following winter, Nolan stood at his window watching Ruby's old crayon snowman, drawing pinned crookedly to his refrigerator, and thought, not for the first time, that the coldest season of his life had somehow led him to the warmest thing left in it. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Winter Veil so you never miss the next one. And let us know in the comments which part of Nolan's journey moved you most. We read every single one.